America's center of power changed, and with it, the dynamics of the political landscape. The consequences will reverberate locally, in Florida, on Capitol Hill, and on the global stage. Voters demanded change on the issues that mattered most: the economy, immigration, and social issues. Now, News4JAX goes beyond the headlines with political analysts who provide unique context and perspective. Experts focused on the issues making headlines. This is Politics and Power.
Not trying to be prophetic here, but the future has a history. And while we can't see into the future, looking into our past can prove powerful. That said, this quote comes to mind. George Bernard Shaw wrote, "We learn from history that we learn nothing from history." History will show 2024 is a political year like no other. It is, quite frankly, a year that has me and many others taken aback. A year that saw Joe Biden drop out of the race. A year that saw Donald Trump nearly assassinated, convicted of 34 felonies, and winning the Oval Office again. It was a year that saw Elon Musk, the world's richest man, become Trump's right-hand man and wield unbelievable power. 2024 was a year that the president-elect is making America Florida again, with the potential for resounding implications and the promise of reformation. With all that said, we set the stage for Politics and Power. I'm Bruce Hamilton, and joining me is News4JAX political analyst and head of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute, Rick Mullaney. Thanks again for joining us, Rick.
Great to be with you, Bruce.
Always good to have you here. So it's tough to decide where we start, but logically, maybe we start with the spot that sparked major change, where Joe Biden faltered in his debate with Donald Trump. Is that where the dominoes started to fall?
Well, Bruce, let me say this. If we're going to highlight some of the big turning points, the most significant events of 2024, then that debate is one of the signature moments of 2024. It was the most consequential presidential debate in U.S. history. It was earlier than any debate in U.S. history, and it had, as I said, the greatest consequence. And it put on stage two big issues. Did Joe Biden have the ability to win, and was Joe Biden fit to serve? And it really was dramatic. But your question was, is that where the dominoes began to fall? It changed things fundamentally, but in my opinion, the real dominoes began to fall for Donald Trump in the spring of 2023 when he was indicted by Alvin Bragg. I believe that the New York prosecution, unlike the other three prosecutions, was the one that when it happened in the spring of 2023, that's when Donald Trump began to improve fundraising, when they began to support him. And while many later would talk about the 34 felony convictions, Donald Trump was able to turn that to his political advantage. I think it helped him win the Republican primary. I think it helped him get momentum, and it took him into 2024. But when we look at 2024, and you're so right in your introductory comments, it is one of the most astounding and unique years in political history in this country, but certainly the debate in June of 2024 was one of the most dramatic, one of the most significant, and it certainly changed the course of history, for the Democratic Party in particular.
You know, and I wonder, we analyze it one way now, but down the road, 10, 15, 20 years from now, how political analysts will look at it. It may be very much differently than we look at it today.
I think one of the things you're going to see in the future, and that's already happening now, is really the fateful decision for Joe Biden to run in the first place. That is, I think, the conventional wisdom, and it appears pretty clear, that it truly was a mistake for Joe Biden to run for a second term. And that his shortcomings were on full display in that debate. The question of could he beat Donald Trump, I think most believed he could not, although the president himself recently says he regrets getting out and he thinks he would have won. But there's the second issue. Was he fit for office? Did he have the physical stamina, the mental capability to serve? And I think the consensus is, and more is coming out every day, that he was very much compromised. And so when history looks back on it, I think for Joe Biden, the judgment of history will be pretty harsh on his decision to run for a second term, and that debate really was an enormous change in 2024.
I think I remember even President Obama, former President Obama, saying, "Joe, do you really want to do this?"
Yeah, I think when the second guessing begins, many will begin to second guess, certainly Joe Biden, but it'll also be the Democratic Party. And how many of them knew? How many of them should have done more? Because one of the concerns was, as you saw in 2024, once he dropped out, there wasn't the time frame for a full-blown primary. You had a very shortened path to the convention on the Democratic side. So it was very, very consequential.
And you and I both know that history is revisionist at best. You know, I remember from my days, studying in school. All right, from that point, faith in Joe Biden's ability to win another term dwindled. And face it, the Democratic Party leadership, Nancy Pelosi, forced him to bow out of the race. And it was a tough decision for a man like Joe Biden.
It was hard. And if you go back to 2024, you may remember he was defiant at first. And for 2 weeks, he was defiant. He refused to get out of the race. And after 50 years of public service, and after he fought to be there, and in his mind, the only person who could beat Donald Trump, you could see why he would resist it. But in the end, with Nancy Pelosi, with Barack Obama, with big funders and others, he really had no choice. And he was forced out. And quite frankly, although that's such a difficult time, I don't think they had any choice because, number one, they did not believe he could have beaten Donald Trump, and I don't believe he could have either. But the second part, it had become readily apparent, even to those who were in doubt before, that he just didn't have the fitness to serve another 4 years in office.
All right, so this all opened the doors, we know, for Kamala Harris. Forever the prosecutor, short on policy, but she went after Trump, and she went after his legal woes.
She did, and I'll tell you, when she first became the nominee, there was a rallying around Kamala Harris. The first thing she had going for her was that she wasn't Joe Biden, and many people were pleased with that, and they could rally around her. They thought they had a chance. The second is that she wasn't Donald Trump, and she had a very strong resume, she spoke well, and she did go after Donald Trump. One of the challenges, however, was the failure to see that that wasn't enough. Simply not being Donald Trump or criticizing Donald Trump wouldn't be enough. And there were some flaws in her candidacy. And much like 2019 and 20, when she ran on the Democratic side, started out strong and then fell back, that's really what happened here. In the end, she didn't put her policy platform on her own forward. Her close association with Joe Biden and her failure to distinguish and to separate herself from Joe Biden really hurt her. And in the end, of course, the economy and the border were too much. But at first, she was going after Donald Trump. The fundraising was very strong. She had a little bit of bump in the convention. She was on a honeymoon for a while, but it wasn't enough.
Yeah, I think you hit on some key points. People criticized her for not doing these one-on-one interviews with the networks, for not having her own policy standards, for not differentiating herself from Joe Biden, and that probably was key.
Those things were big factors. And Bruce, if we go back, and this is just a parlor game that people will play, if Joe Biden had gotten out earlier, and if there had been a full-blown primary, she might have been the nominee, but she might not have been. It could have been Shapiro from Pennsylvania, or Bashir from Kentucky, or Whitmer from Michigan. And for those candidates, it would have been much easier to separate themselves from Joe Biden, particularly on the border policy, for example, and on some of the other issues that really hurt Kamala Harris in the general election. But for Kamala Harris, as vice president and as being loyal to Joe Biden, she did not separate herself from his policies. And those policies were fundamentally unpopular with the American people, particularly on inflation and on the border.
There's another bigger question, and this may be inflammatory, but is America ready to elect a black woman? And a lot of people ask that very question after you analyze the results of what happened in the election.
Well, I don't know the answer to that one.
I don't know that we know the answer. But
in the end, I'm not so sure that was the challenge here. I really do believe that part of this election was inflation. Mm-hmm. And that when you have a 20% increase in prices, the highest in 40 years, and you're at the grocery store and you're trying to get gas, you're trying to buy a house with high interest rates, it's just simply on the mind of the American people. It was a big issue. So was border. And that doesn't matter whether you're a female or male on the Democratic side. You're not going to be able to do away with the fact that you had that inflation problem, you had that border crisis. With Joe Biden, of course, it was the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which obviously I think was the beginning of some of the drop in his popularity. So I'm not so sure, by the way, given the unpopularity of Joe Biden's administration, any Democrat could have won, but I think Kamala Harris's close association with Joe Biden made it particularly difficult for her.
So it goes back to what James Carville said, 30, 40 years ago, it's the economy, stupid.
That was a big part of what happened. It's not the only part of what happened, but it was a big part of the outcome of what, by the way, the defining moment in 2024 was this astounding election. Okay. The greatest comeback in political history with Donald Trump. But if you're trying to do the rehash of what in 2024, what was the difference? Certainly the economy's at the top of the list.
Despite the fact that the president really has nothing to do with the economy, but, people will argue that. Let's talk about Donald Trump's legal woes. He had a galaxy of them and ultimately became the first former president to be convicted on 34 felony counts.
Bruce, he had a galaxy of them. They come in a bunch of categories. The first category would be criminal indictments. There were 4, 2 out of state court and 2 in federal court. The one in state court in particular, out of New York, I think he turned that to his political advantage. In that particular case out of New York, which involved business records and payments to Stormy Daniels, the U.S. Attorney's Office refused to prosecute based on the same facts. The Manhattan DA's office under Vance refused to prosecute. Alvin Bragg decided to go forward, making Donald Trump the first former president ever to be indicted. I believe that indictment allowed Donald Trump to discredit other charges that, quite frankly, were more legitimate. The records case against Donald Trump was strong and powerful, and I believe the most difficult case for him. And it was not the same as Joe Biden's case. Joe Biden's case, mishandling of classified documents, you can have that discussion. But for Donald Trump, in that federal case, it was more than just mishandling. It was the destruction of documents. It was the obstruction of justice. It was the failure to comply with the subpoena, a very strong case. And then, of course, there was another federal case for election interference out of D.C., and then, of course, one out of Georgia. Those were 4. Then you had 2 civil cases in sexual assault. Then you had the New York Letitia James bringing a civil fraud case. A case, again, that was much highly criticized. It involved Donald Trump getting a favorable interest rate for what he had done, and the banks saying they had been paid, but a $450 million judgment with interest against Donald Trump. To say he had a host of legal woes is an understatement, but the key, one of the keys for Donald Trump certainly, was that the only one that went to trial in the criminal category was New York. The others did not go to trial. That meant that yet before November, that paved the way to November. He had a host of legal woes, but I will tell you, those 34 felony convictions, there's a Democratic lens and there's a Republican lens. And for many on the Democratic side, they see 34 convictions and they say, that's disqualifying, how can you elect him? On the Republican side, they say, that is a symbol of a political prosecution. He was being a victim. We're going to rally around him. That was corrupt. And so 2 different lenses, very same case.
And I do have to point out that as we're doing this show, there is a situation that's playing out right now that Judge Merchan said we're going to go ahead with the sentencing hearing on Friday. It'll be curious to see whether or not the former president is going to go ahead and appeal this. But it is clear that Judge Merchan, if you read his 18-page opinion, was certainly trying to make a point here, because he's saying that Donald Trump is trying to throw dirt in the face of the judiciary, and Merchan is saying you're not going to get away with it.
Well, already there's an appeal. He's trying to stop that before Friday. Merchan has already indicated he's not going to impose any penalties, no jail time, nothing like that. A lot of this is symbolism, of course, but that symbolism is important to both. It's important to Donald Trump. I expect him to fight it tooth and nail. I believe that particular case is very vulnerable on appeal in terms of the substance of it, lots of issues there. But as we having this discussion, that is going forward for sentencing on at this time, that's scheduled for Friday.
Be interesting to see how that all plays out. Donald Trump, throughout all of this, has had his boxing gloves on. And the Supreme Court handed him some modicum of victory on the issue of presidential immunity. Not a total victory, mind you, but a bit of insulation.
Bruce, one of the most significant things to come out of the Supreme Court's decision on immunity was the fact that they remanded it to the trial court to make findings on what were official acts and unofficial acts. And therefore, it fundamentally changed the nature of the prosecution, the scope of the prosecution. But what that really meant was that the trial would not take place before November. And that was an out-and-out victory for Donald Trump. Certainly, Jack Smith with the federal government wanted to have that case tried before Election Day. Based on the ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court, that was not going to happen. That was very, very consequential. In the spring of last year, in 2024, when there were 4 criminal cases, 2 state and 2 federal pending, it appeared those criminal cases could derail his candidacy. In the end, other than New York, nothing went to trial. You saw a little bit of a self-destruction on the Georgia case. The documents case out of Florida got dismissed on a technicality for now as to whether Jack Smith was properly appointed. And then, of course, this ruling on the Supreme Court. So this turned out to be a pretty significant step and the pathway for Donald Trump to win this election.
All right, so let's talk about Ms. Harris again. She held her own in the debates against the Donald, did better than many expected. She got a bump in the polls as a result.
Bruce, I think she did better than held her own. She flat out won that debate. She was prepared. She was strategic. She went after Donald Trump. She wanted to go get under his skin. She did. And Donald Trump was the opposite. He was not prepared. He was flustered. It was a very poor performance. And post-debate, she had increased fundraising. She did have a little bit of a bump in the polls. So if you're looking at purely from a debate standpoint, she did very well. She won that debate. But it wasn't enough. In the weeks that followed, she began to fall in the polls. Some of that goes back to something we talked about earlier, not having answers on policy, not separating herself from Joe Biden. And maybe even too late, she began to have a new approach on interviews. She was going to answer those questions. And then I think the vice presidential debate, by the way, with J.D. Vance really was a big boost on the Republican side. But if you go back to that point in time, that window, Kamala Harris was really at her peak in the weeks following that debate. She did very, very well. But as we know, it wouldn't be enough.
No, she lost her momentum. The unthinkable happened. The first of 2 assassination attempts, the first in Butler County, Pennsylvania, and there was a new resolve in Donald Trump, a new fight. In fact, if you remember right afterwards, you could see him say, fight. And in the nation, he found a new support.
Bruce, I think this played into Donald Trump defining himself as the fighter, defining himself as resilient, defining himself, they're coming after him, and he's the one who stands between, is protecting you. And by the way, you do have to say, in that assassination attempt, his instincts, his reaction were somewhat iconic. They're caught on that photograph, that lifting of the arm, that defiant approach.
With blood dripping down his face?
Certainly helped define his candidacy and his persona. Whether you support Donald Trump or don't support Donald Trump, there has to be a recognition of the resilience of Donald Trump in the face of, as we've mentioned, 2 assassination attempts, 2 impeachment attempts, 4 criminal cases, 2 civil suits, 1 civil fraud case. He remained defiant, he moved forward, and I think on those assassination attempts, it helped galvanize support and helped define him for, as he wanted to be defined, as the fighter and resilient. And his argument is he's fighting for you, Washington is not.
And the message is clear, nothing will get me down. Nothing will keep me down.
He's going to fight to the end.
Right. So Election Day, everybody watches the vote filter in. And though in the end it was not the mandate that Trump proclaimed, because when California finally came in, the vote was closer than people believed, it was clear the polls got it wrong again.
Well, Bruce, a couple things. First of all, Donald Trump outperformed the polls in 2016, in 2020, and he outperformed in 2024. But if we want to do a rehash of 2024 as the most astounding political year, one of the most astounding in the history of our country, if you want to say what was the signature event, it was the election of Donald Trump. This is, without question, the biggest political comeback of anyone in U.S. history, and quite frankly, one of the great political comebacks of anybody in history. His win was astounding. If you go back to January 6th and the weeks following January 6th, many people, of course, had written him off. If you go back to the fall of 2022 and there was supposed to be a red wave, and there was not a red wave, and many of Donald Trump's candidates had lost, and Ron DeSantis had a window when he was very popular, Donald Trump appeared very vulnerable. He appeared done. And then, as I mentioned before, the spring of 2023, when he was indicted by Alvin Bragg, I believe was a triggering event that began his comeback. To believe that he could navigate those criminal indictments, the civil cases against him, assassination attempts, all the way to Election Day and win. And by the way, as we just talked about the polls were actually within the margin of error, but they did miss quite a few things. All 7 swing states went for Donald Trump. Now, remember this. A 2% change in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and Kamala Harris is the President of the United States. But they got them wrong there, and they got them wrong in Arizona, and Nevada, and Georgia, and North Carolina. He swept them all. By the way, even in the bluest of states, New Jersey, New York, California, he did much better than projected. And in some of those purplish states, Virginia, he did much better. So although it is not a landslide in that sense, Ronald Reagan had a landslide in 1980. He won by 18% in the popular vote. Donald Trump here won by about 1.5 points in terms of the popular vote. It was significant. For many, it was stunning. But early on election night, you could see the trend. It was Donald Trump, and it is one of the most remarkable and stunning political comebacks in U.S. history.
Oh, no doubt. I'm thinking now, what was it, 2016? You and I were leaving here about 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was the first time that Donald Trump won. And we were like, Ricky Ricardo, what happened? You know, and we were like, I don't know if we could ever believe in the polls again.
Well, I believe 2024 was very different from 2016.
No doubt.
2016 was a stunner, and many thought it was maybe flawed or an aberration. 2024, those polls were tight going in, and there was always a sense that if there was a shift of a couple points in either candidate's direction, they could win by a significant electoral margin, which he did, 312 electoral votes to 226. But Donald Trump, as I said earlier, outperformed the polls every single time he has run. He did it again in 2024. And in advance, you knew if he outperformed those polls, he would be the next president of the United States. And that is exactly what he did it, what happened, and he did it among every demographic group. It was a very stunning performance.
But I think my point is that that's really the first time that you and I started to really question the efficacy of these polls and the validity of them.
Well, they certainly got it way wrong in 2016. Yeah. I believe the polling has improved. In 2022 and off midterm elections, they were actually pretty close. Here, many of them were within the margin of error, but they certainly missed the bigger trend, and the bigger trend was momentum for Donald Trump and significant inroads for Donald Trump in virtually every state and in every demographic group.
Yeah, definitely there. Joe Biden, after what happened, did what he could to salvage his legacy. And legacy is very important to Joe Biden. But along the way, he made major headlines offering his son Hunter a blanket pardon. How do you think that history is going to remember Joe Biden, who worried very much about that legacy?
Hard question, Bruce. I think Biden and his supporters will try to point to many significant legislative accomplishments. For example, the infrastructure bill, over $1 trillion investment in infrastructure throughout the country. He'll point to the microchips, that legislation to make us more competitive and less dependent on Taiwan. They'll point, as you mentioned earlier, to the economy, in which GDP is up, low unemployment. He has things that he will point to. On the policy side, of course, the reason he was unpopular was because of inflation, because of the border, the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. But your question was on the judgment of history, and because of his decision to run for a second term, and because of his debate performance and dropping out, I think the potential for the judgment of history could get harsher with time. I think the judgment is already beginning to come in that Joe Biden was compromised from a fitness standpoint, greater than people recognize publicly. And that will be part, unfortunately for him, part of his legacy. And although many fathers understand the pardoning of Hunter Biden, I believe that Hunter Biden, that is understandable in one way. I think if he had approached it differently, maybe it would have...
Not a blanket pardon. Also targeted pardon,
and also maybe not criticizing his own Justice Department for the prosecution, but instead just saying as a father he had made a different decision and that Hunter Biden had suffered enough. But that was also very, very unpopular. It's always hard to tell because many of the policies he put in place, we've yet to see how they work out. Some of that will affect the judgment of history, but I suspect that one of the questions of history will be, they will ask the question, why did he run for a second term? That debate, his fitness for office, will be big parts of his legacy.
Yeah, it's also interesting to know when you talk about the economy, some of the markers are very healthy.
They are.
But the way that the average American views the economy is very different. At the checkout counter at the grocery store, mortgage interest rates, the housing market, and things like that, they're not healthy in the minds of the average American.
Bruce, I think that is one of the most fundamental shortcomings of the Harris candidacy, of the Biden candidacy, of the Democratic Party in this presidential election, is not recognizing how millions of Americans were suffering in an economy that they thought was great, because it wasn't great for them. When you go try to buy a house and interest rates are up and prices are up and you can't afford a house, that's a big deal. When you want to retire, but you can't retire because you can't afford to retire now, that's a big deal. If you're a young couple and you're trying to make ends meet and you can't, that's a big deal. And that describes broad swaths of the American population going into this election. And this notion of you don't understand the economy is good is a bit patronizing and arrogant and quite frankly didn't resonate with people. And there had to be an understanding of that. And I do think inflation is at the top of the list in taking a look at what happened in this election. There are other factors, but I put that at the top of the list.
Now, one thing that's very important to Joe Biden is a peaceful transition. He did something that his predecessor, Donald Trump, did not, invited him to the Oval Office after the election to talk about the road ahead, no doubt gritting his teeth the entire time. But that peaceful transition was important to Joe Biden.
Bruce, I think that peaceful transition was important to Biden. I think it's important to the nation. It's one of the defining parts of who we are as a country. You mentioned, however, Joe Biden gritting his teeth. There's no doubt there's no love lost between these two. But there's a little bit, you could see it in the smile on his face with Joe Biden, a little bit of maybe some personal self-satisfaction. The way he'd been forced out, the way he told that he couldn't win and that Donald Trump had won. For him, a little bit of maybe he might have viewed as a little bit of personal vindication for those who doubted him. But in the end, that peaceful transition of power is fundamental for what we've had for over 248 years, actually. And so for Joe Biden, as an institutionalist, having been around for 50 years, was very important to him and the country.
And he wants him to be there, before the inauguration. Joe Biden says he'll be there for the inaugural ceremony. Those things are very important to Joe Biden.
I think they are, and I think they should be important to every president.
They should be, because it talks to democracy. We have looked to the past with an eye toward the future. How did it pave the way? If 2024 brought about political upheaval, what do we expect in the way of eye-opening surprises in the year ahead? Well, Donald Trump has an ambitious day one agenda. Will he be successful? Will it alter the nation's trajectory? And what does history really tell us about the future? Is George Bernard Shaw right? More to come on Politics and Power. Be right back. Welcome back to Politics and Power, talking about what happened in 2024, how it paves the way to 2025. My guest, News4JAX political analyst and head of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute, the always enlightening Rick Mullaney. Good to have you here. So Donald Trump, lining the way to Inauguration Day, January 20th, with some very interesting cabinet choices. Fox News hosts, people with questionable backgrounds, some with credentials, but definite loyalists who will carry out his agenda. So in many ways, he is making America Florida in choosing the likes of Pam Bondi as AG, Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. What does that tell you?
Well, first of all, this Florida contingent isn't limited there, as you just pointed. It's Marco Rubio, of course, Pam Bondi, it's Susie Wiles as Chief of Staff, it's Mike Walls for National Security Advisor. Certainly his lean towards Florida. Part of that is a reflection that Florida really is red. It is a red state now. It is no longer purple. And some of that leadership comes out of Florida, and he has the relationship here in Florida. But as you look to these appointments, Bruce, and the other ones you've mentioned, one of the things it tells you is that 2024 is very different from 2016. That this is a very different Donald Trump. Donald Trump this time is more confident, he feels more knowledgeable, and he also is just going to get who he wants. And what at the top of his list is going to be their loyalty. Now, loyalty is a good thing in general, but what Donald Trump wants loyalty plus. Sometimes that loyalty that, on all these issues, and in particular, he wants those loyalists. For his cabinet picks overall, some of them I think will have bipartisan support and will be very well received. Marco Rubio is in that category. I expect him to go through very quickly. Doug Burgum will go through very quickly. Susie Wiles isn't subject to confirmation, but generally that appointment has been very well received. Others of these appointments, Pam Bondi, I believe, will get approved in the end. It'll be a little bit of a bumpier confirmation hearing, but she will get approved. But you do have several. Take a look at Pete Hegseth, for example, in defense and what that hearing's going to look like. Take a look at Patel when it comes to the FBI director, Tulsi Gabbard for national intelligence. In the end, however, Donald Trump has strong support in the Senate. He carries great weight with them. So these confirmation hearings will be significant. They'll be worth watching. That has to play out. But Donald Trump wants his team in place. And unlike 2016, in his mind, he knows what he wants. He knows who he wants, and he's going to do a full court press to get the people he wants.
I can't help but wonder if he's got some sacrificial lambs in there.
Well, some people have wondered whether he's playing three-dimensional chess. For example, when he nominated Matt Gaetz, and whether that was done strategically. I tend to think not. I think it was simply a bad appointment. So we'll have to see how this plays out. But he wants all the people he's nominated, he wants them approved, and he wants them approved fairly quickly. But I think some of these confirmation hearings will be somewhat explosive and worth watching.
I still wonder if Pete Hegseth's going to get it. I mean, there's so much bad mojo surrounding him, and the speculation is that if he doesn't get it, that it would be Ron DeSantis' defense secretary.
Bruce, there was a time when I truly, on this program, where I really did think his nomination was in serious jeopardy, highly unlikely he would get it. That has sort of shifted. I do believe today the odds tend to favor it, that he will get confirmed. However, this is one where the confirmation hearing could matter. This is one where it could be significant. Odds favor his confirmation, but it's not yet a done deal.
Right. Same thing with Kash Patel, although I think his nomination might be in bigger jeopardy.
I believe that's true, and the same with Tulsi Gabbard. I think those three in particular will be hearings worth watching.
All right. The right-wing populist agenda that Mr. Trump wants to enact, which, by the way, is reflective of what's happening in many other countries around the world. With this Congress, how successful do you think it might be?
Well, first of all, Bruce, it's important to keep in mind what Donald Trump can do without Congress. And one of his first day agendas, and top of his list, is going to be immigration.
You're talking about executive orders.
I'm talking about, he can do, without Congress, he can do executive orders. And as J.D. Vance pointed out in his debate, his view was that Joe Biden had rescinded 93 executive orders. Now remember, each administration can rescind those executive orders, but I fully expect on day one, literally day one with Donald Trump, you will see a series of executive orders when it comes to the border, and he can do that without Congress. There's another area where he has significant authority, and that is on tariffs, and he has been talking about tariffs a great deal. Now, some of this gets debated among constitutional scholars as to how far he can go, but as you've seen in the past, and I think he'll push the limits of this, even without Congress, he can push that pretty far when it comes to tariffs. There's sort of a third category. He does need Congress, but when it comes to the budget and his tax cuts in particular and appropriations, he can do that through reconciliation. And all that, the short version means he can do that with a simple majority vote in the U.S. Senate, as opposed to being subject to a filibuster. So in answer to your question, what can he get done early? I believe he'll make significant steps on the border. He'll make significant steps, and he does have the authority on tariffs. He's going to have to make a decision, or The House of Representatives is going to have to make a decision through reconciliation. Are they going to do one bill or two bills, or how they're going to approach the budget and preserving the Donald Trump tax cuts? But in the end, he will at least have the reconciliation process. On bigger things, Bruce, on those policy things, remember in the U.S. Senate, that is subject to the filibuster. That means 60 votes. They have a 3-person margin, so he's going to have to work with Congress on some of those bigger issues. But for Donald Trump, with the stroke of the pen, he can do quite a bit on executive order for some of his priorities.
Some of it, he's going to have to tiptoe, like China. We just had the cybersecurity attack against the U.S. Treasury. He invited Xi Jinping to come to his inauguration. Xi said, no, I'm not coming. Then you've got the whole issue of tariffs against China, which is the U.S.'s largest trading partner. That's a road that he's got to tread lightly on right now.
It's going to be very challenging. There are clearly some China hawks that he's appointed. That includes Marco Rubio, that includes Mike Walls, and certainly among many, China is the #1 economic and military concern. Donald Trump has been eyeing them, in particular when it comes to tariffs and large tariffs. So you're right, Bruce. That is one of the ones to keep an eye on in 2025.
All right. So if 2024 was a political year of upheaval and surprise, we know Donald Trump has his own agenda, and if he's moving forward like a bull in a china shop, do you see 2025 as the beginning of a political reformation, as I referred to it at the start of this program?
No. Here's what I mean by that. I don't think it's the beginning of a reformation. I think it's the continuation of one. I think we've been seeing for a number of years now a realignment in the Republican Party and a realignment in the Democratic Party that's very significant. And there are some who say they look back to 2016 and now they go, look what Donald Trump has caused. And there's another school of thought that says, look what our circumstance has produced. It has produced Donald Trump. There was a time when the Democratic Party, of course, was the party of the working class. There was a time when the Republican Party was the party of the highly educated. What you've seen is a fundamental realignment. The Republican Party is no longer the party of Ronald Reagan. The Democratic Party is no longer the party of Bill Clinton or even Barack Obama.
Am I wrong in saying that the Democratic Party is in tatters, doesn't know what it is, and has to define itself?
It is.
Not just redefine itself, but define itself.
It is clearly seeking an identity, and they're going and they are rehashing where they've been and who they are. There are fractures in both parties. It wasn't that long ago when the Republicans lost to Barack Obama that they wondered whether they would ever win again. But you've seen a dramatic shift, particularly with Donald Trump's appeal to the working class. Is that unique to Donald Trump, or is that something the Republicans carry forward? We'll have to see. But in answer to your question, do I believe this is the beginning? I don't necessarily believe it's the beginning. I think this realignment has been going on for a while. It is significant, but you're going to see it play out in public policy in the year ahead. As you mentioned in the earlier question, this populist agenda, you're going to see some of that in 2025 prior to the midterms, which is Donald Trump really has a window of about 18 months to go forward. Most likely the midterms will cause a little bit of a shift, particularly with that map in the Senate. But the United States today and the two political parties is undergoing a pretty fundamental realignment.
But there's even a bit of an alignment going on among the Republicans. I mean, you look at what's going on with the whole issue of HB1 visas. Donald Trump says, well, I was always in favor of it. No, you go back, to 2016, and he was totally against it. So he's kind of changed his position, too.
It would be a mistake to believe that because Republicans may have come home in this past election, that they're monolithic. They are not. It is a very fractured party, and that's just one example.
All right. So I started the show with a George Bernard Shaw quote saying, we learn from history that we learn nothing from history. So let's put a bow on things with this from English theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking, who very succinctly said, we spend a great deal of time studying history, which, let's face it, is mostly the history of stupidity. Who gets it right, Rick? George Bernard Shaw or Stephen Hawking?
Bruce, I'm not so sure they disagree that much. I think they both have a sense that we are continuing to make mistakes and we're not learning from history. And even when we've been stupid in the past, we've failed to learn those lessons from the past. Certainly at the Public Policy Institute, when we talk to our students about history and public policy, one of the great lessons, and we can fail to learn this lesson, is we think short-term instead of long-term, and those short-term thinking begins to lead to very disastrous results. When Ronald Reagan took the presidency in 1980, our budget was $1 trillion. Today it's $36 trillion. I believe that is sort of that fiscal crisis is something that you hear about on the right, but you don't hear about much on the left. That short-term thinking is also a big challenge on the environment and climate change. That's something you hear about a lot on the left, and a little bit on the right. As policies play out on tariffs, this trend towards isolationism, the spending that we've been going through, the debt crisis, climate change, international policy, this trend, like I said, towards isolationism, we'll see how all that plays out. And have we learned from history? Or quite frankly, what's often very dangerous is learning the wrong lessons from history. So in answer to your question, I think they kind of agree that one of the great shortcomings is that we repeat the mistakes of the past because we simply either don't understand it, we don't learn from it, or we don't have the political will to do what we need to do.
So is it too cliche to say what's old is new again?
Maybe so.
Rick, always eye-opening. I appreciate you. A reminder, you can watch Politics in Power on demand anytime at your leisure on the News4JAX YouTube channel or news4jax.com. We'd love for you to weigh in as long as you, if you do disagree with anything that's said here, do so in a polite manner. Have a great day, certainly.
See why every day more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.